After Le Mans, we went to Aintree for the 12th British Grand Prix. Thursday practice had been wet and miserable. Moss was quickest, with the two Astons second and third. The rain continued into Friday morning, but by the afternoon the track began to dry. Dennis Jenkinson of Motorsport, as usual, just quietly watched, taking everything in. The Astons were again to be driven by Carroll Shelby and Roy Salvadori. They had not entered the previous Grand Prix at Reims, where the Ferraris of Tony Brooks and Phil Hill had finished first and second. Salvadori, aided by Eric Hine, prepared to go out again. "I could do with some more padding for this seat, Eric." Stirling Moss was entered in the pale green British Racing Partnership, BRM. Maurice Trintignant drove the Rob Walker-entered Cooper Climax. Strikes in Italy had prevented the Scuderia Ferrari from travelling and had released Tony Brooks to drive for the resurrected Vanwall team in a lightweight version of their classic front-engined car. On Saturday morning, there was a driver's parade in BMC's groundbreaking Frog Eye Sprites. Salvadori led away, followed by his teammate Carroll Shelby. Stirling was hoping for better fortune at Aintree. So far in 1959, he had failed to finish a single Formula One race. Harry Schell was on the front row of the grid. Joe Bonnier, who had won the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, had qualified 10th. Works BRMs were entered for Schell, Bonnier and Ron Flockhart. Tony Brooks had had an unhappy practice in the Vanwall, which was simply too slow. The Works Coopers were driven by Jack Brabham, Maston Gregory and rising star Bruce McLaren. Drivers and spectators alike would have no problem identifying the pale green of Moss's BRM. Aintree's slow corners suited the sweet-handling Astons, and they'd posted competitive times in practice. Salvadori was second, behind poleman Brabham, and Shelby was in sixth. Reg Parnell briefed Shelby and Salvadori, whilst David Brown talked to Earl Howe. The two Aston drivers prepared for the 225 miles ahead. Meanwhile, their team manager, Reg Parnell, was asking his old sparring partner, Lofty England, if there was any prospect of Jaguars returning to racing. Harry Schell had a quick word with David Brown. Moss and Joe Bonnier were both driving BRMs. At the start, Jack Brabham, leading the World Championship by 4 points from Brooks, took the lead as the pack charged towards Waterways Corner. The opposite-locking Brabham immediately opened up a gap. There was a 6-car scrap for second place. Salvadori came in, worried as he was getting sprayed with fuel, but this was just the overflow from the Aston's very full tanks, and he was sent on his way again. Shortly after, Shelby came in with the same complaint. The good qualifying positions of both Aston Martins had been squandered, and the cars were now well down. Tony Brooks retired the van well early, with ignition and brake trouble. At least for the next race, he would be back in a Ferrari. Salvadori tried to make up for lost time. Moss was about 15 seconds behind the leader, Brabham. Dory's Maserati had an off and retired soon after. The graceful 250F Maserati, which had been the mainstay of Formula One through the 50s, and which had carried Fangio to his 4th successive World Championship in 1957, has by now had its day, a legend in its own lifetime. Salvadori climbed back to 6th place, but Shelby had a dud magneto, which meant his Aston's engine was firing with 6 blows instead of 12, causing a major power loss. Joe Bonnier's BRM retired with a broken throttle linkage. David Brown checked his car's lap times. On lap 50, Moss, whilst running second, 10 seconds behind Brabham, was forced to pit for a new left rear tyre. He rejoined the race 15 seconds ahead of third-place man Bruce McLaren. Shelby was now dropping further and further behind. Up at the sharp end, Brabham now had a 50-second lead, but Moss was catching, and Brabham was trying to preserve his tyres to avoid another pit stop. Gregory stopped for water. Shelby was now running behind one of the Lotus 16s. Shell also had to have his left rear changed. Moss had now pulled back 20 seconds over Brabham. After such an encouraging debut at Silverstone, and here in practice, the Astons were now really struggling against the rear-engined cars. Reliability wasn't their strong suit either. The Aston mechanics tried in vain, but Shelby was soon out of the race. Salvadori was pushing on in 6th place. Brabham won by 22 seconds, having led the entire race. Sterling took second, just 0.2 of a second ahead of McLaren. The BRM and the Cooper having had a terrific scrap after Sterling had been forced to pit again for fuel.